I'm George Galloway, and I present Kali Mahorra on Al-Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kali Mahorra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kali Mahorra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al-Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kali Mahorra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but ready to tour the world, for this is the review of 2018. A totally momentous year. Most years nowadays are interesting. The Chinese saying that we are doomed to live in interesting times is borne out every year, but 2018 has been something special. Special bad and special good. The good, the bad, and the ugly are all on the order paper today. I suppose if this was Time magazine, you'd have to give Man of the Year to Donald Trump, the President of the United States, not because you like him, and not even because you hate him, but because he has towered over the year like a colossus, for good or for ill. We'll discover in the course of this debate this evening, where we have, as usual, some very distinguished experts and some enthusiastic amateurs like me. Donald Trump may still be the president by the time you see this film, or he may not, but then you could have said that last year, and you might even be able to say it next year. The judicial pursuit of Donald Trump and his family and his lawyers and his businesses is gathering pace by all accounts. And it may very well be that he becomes a president who was thrown out of office by the judicial system in his own country. Or he might complete his term and might even win a second. Anything is possible would be the motto, the rubric of this year. Not many people thought it was possible that Trump would win. Not many people thought it was possible that Britain would vote to leave the European Union. Not many people thought it was possible that the alphabet soup of Islamist extremism that laid siege to the very gates of Damascus, for example, would, as we approach the end of this year, now be facing a total and absolute defeat, having now just been forced from their very last urban stronghold in Syria. Not that the Syrian war is over, certainly not that the Syrian story is over, but it's definitely a different war and a different story now. All the predictions of many statesmen, as they call themselves, that the government in Damascus was going to be overthrown and replaced by some bizarre coalition of pro-American and pro-Islamist fundamentalist forces is definitely not going to happen. The Palestinian people haven't had a good 2018 either. Not only have they continued to suffer the injury that they have suffered every year for well over half a century, they have the insult of being almost entirely forgotten. The Palestinians in 2018 were an almost entirely forgotten people, even though they were being murdered at the fence in Gaza in industrial quantities. Only now and again, when a nurse or a journalist or a particularly small child was killed at the gate by snipers from the other side of that fence, did they make any news value at all. Ditto the people in Yemen, who have undergone an almost biblical experience, not right down to plague benighting their land. They are suffering from cholera. They are suffering from starvation. They are suffering from siege, and they are suffering from ceaseless bombardment by the Saudi Air Force, flying and dropping Western armaments sold to them. Not that Saudi Arabia has had a good 2018. As a matter of fact, Saudi Arabia ends 2018 in the lowest public relations hors that it has ever done. The United States Senate has just found the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia guilty of murder most foul of the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, and consequences will follow. Already consequences have followed. The Americans have demanded an end to the war in Yemen, though not quite loudly enough to actually bring it to an end yet. But the Yemenis have lost thousands of people in the Arab world's poorest country in 2018, as indeed in the year before it. I suppose another of the biggest stories of the year has been the ongoing confrontation between the West and Russia on the front of the Ukraine, of the Crimea, or in Syria, or on the streets of England. The attempted murder of 2 Russian citizens in Salisbury has been comprehensively blamed by the Western powers on the Russian government, the Russian state, and its intelligence service, the GRU. The 2 people who it was said were the victims of an attempted murder plot survived, but the English woman who found some of the material that the assailants had apparently brought into the country has since passed, and her partner is gravely ill. This has led to a renewed wave of sanctions and ostracism, a deep freeze in relations between the West and Russia, particularly here in Britain. There are many, many other international stories, some of them success stories, some of them not. And we're going to discuss them all as much as we can this evening. Mike Yardley, you are a former British Army officer. You're an intelligence expert. You know the world. How do you view 2018?
Chaos, conflict, extremes appearing, centre ground falling away. We've seen the US midterms. We've seen an extraordinary conflict politically developing in the US. We've seen that across Europe. We've seen recently Macron's whole new image dream falling to pieces. We've seen all the stuff going on, these extraordinary things that happened with Brexit, with the referendum, people in yellow vests. What does it all really mean? I think one thing is becoming apparent, is that the old politics isn't working. And we're seeing, whether it's to the right or the left, people don't feel sufficiently well represented. But let's take an overview of this. As it happens, my son's an economist, and I was talking to him today about this, and he said, well, we're also late economic cycle. The current economic cycle's 9 or 10 years old. Usually the economic cycle's about 7 years old. Bad things tend to happen at the end of economic cycles. Now look around Europe. Look at the conflict between Italy and the EU, for example. Look at our own economy. Look at the situation we have with Brexit, whichever side you're on with that. There are some very strange things going on at the moment, and the world is changing in a fundamental way, and it's very hard to predict. You look at Saudi. Saudi's, of course, a US client state. Basically what Trump has said to the Saudi regime is this: well, don't put up the oil price, and we're not going to come after you any further for what went on with the death of Khashoggi. That's basically at the bottom line of it as I read it. All round us, though, we see unpredictable and rather scary events. And I think people are worried about it. I think they're deeply concerned and anxious about where we're going. We see the mess of Brexit. I mean, again, whichever way you look at it, you can't say it's been a great success thus far. You see what's happening with instability in the world, a return to the old Cold War. I have to say, as an old soldier, that I think that Britain, as the airstrip, the UK, or whatever you want to call us these days, is extremely vulnerable. We haven't really got enough troops. The army, theoretically on paper, is down to something like 70,000. I suspect in reality it's less than that. If you were to look at our resources, I don't think there's going to be a tank battle in Europe again, probably not. But we've got something like 150 tanks, and I'm told 50 of them work. The Russians have got 15,000 tanks or thereabouts. So there's a huge disparity there. And Putin, who's played a blinder of a game, I mean, you look at the way he's used Syria to his benefit. He's played a great chess game. It may not be to our advantage, but it seems to have been to his advantage thus far. And you do think, where will all this lead? Will it lead to a new Cold War? Sort of. That seems to be happening a bit now. Let's hope we can talk ourselves down from that. I believe everything boils down to money. So as far as Russia's concerned, you've got the sanctions, which have had heavy impact and which they would like to see removed. You saw them as they test our airspace and they test our waters. They tested us with Salisbury, and Europe stayed together. Of course, Russia has a strategic objective to break up the European Union. People create, this creates strange alliances and ideas, because you've got the sort of the right-wing Brexiteers, if you want to call them that, and you've also got probably the Russian intelligence services who would love to see conflict in Europe because they see that as playing to their strategic advantage. But May, to her credit, after Salisbury, got all of Europe together, and they all condemned the Russian action in Salisbury, and that was quite a surprising political victory in the midst of all the mess. Let's go to Northern Ireland. I spend a lot of time in Northern Ireland. I've got a lot of friends in Northern Ireland. I've had a personal threat there many years ago. I know what the game is there. I have friends on both sides of the religious and political divide, but there are no moderates anymore. There's no SDLP. It's all, it's Sinn Féin, it's DUP. And you look at the border, I don't think there will ever be a border returning to Ireland. Nobody wants that border. So who would impose that border? EU troops? The Republic of Ireland isn't going to build a border. We're not going to build that border. Most of the people on either side of the invisible border don't want a border. So I don't think that's going to happen. So when you hear it discussed, I think there's a lot of BS in that. So
let me ask
next?
you, because you're the military man here, Trump has announced that the United States will withdraw from the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, because he says Russia has breached it. Russia denies that. Does that mean that the United States will, as happened briefly in the early 80s, before Reagan and Gorbachev took a walk in the woods, that short and medium-range nuclear weapons will return to the European mainland? Which European countries would allow that? And Russia has said it will respond. That would be even worse than the year we just had, wouldn't it?
It would. And I think that there probably will be a walk in the woods at some time in the future. Meantime, wars don't always start for logical reasons. And when you have a situation where Russia is rearming in the way it is, where you have tensions increasing, and you have Trump, because of his rather bombastic, full-on style, not doing much to diffuse the situation, this is dangerous. This is more dangerous than it was. So that is of genuine concern, yeah.
On the other hand, Adam Garrie, you're a historian of note, but also someone very much up to date on the geopolitical stage. The Koreas, who, if we'd had this program last Christmas, we would have said was the biggest danger of nuclear confrontation anywhere present in the world, the Koreans are now in the midst of a love fest. They can't hug each other, kiss each other enough. And peace has broken out on the Korean peninsula. That's been one of the good stories of the year, hasn't it?
Well, indeed, there's a tendency for people, when a microphone is close to their face, to speak shock and horror. We instantly go from being objective experts to Vincent Prices. But I would call 2018 the Dickensian year. It was the best of times for some, it was the worst of times for others, and it couldn't really get much better than that which we saw unfold in Korea. It was the moment that Koreans had been waiting for, not just since 1953, not just even since the late 1940s, in many ways since 1910, when the Japanese occupied an entire Korean peninsula. And now you have a Korean peninsula that is gradually and on a very humane but pragmatic level tearing down the artificial political barriers imposed on them, and doing so with Korean characteristics. And I think it's quite extraordinary that for an America that was threatening literally nuclear war to destroy North Korea, said Donald Trump at the palace of peace that is the UN General Assembly. We now have the two leaders, Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in, taking it into their own hands while the US largely sits back and watches. In fact, Trump has admitted this. It's been going on for a while, but he recently tweeted that it's a gradual process, it's going well, and I have full faith in Kim Jong-un, the man he taunted.
Let's be fair, it's to Trump's credit. It's not at all clear that a President Hillary Clinton would have allowed the Koreans to choose peace, is it?
Well, a President Hillary Clinton would have been a president status quo, only worse than Barack Obama, because I really believe psychologically there are skeletons in that political closet that Obama, as someone who came in with hope and left with nope, didn't have. But with Trump, it's everything but the status quo. And in Korea, the fact that he was willing to take that gamble for personal and political advantage, as most political and geopolitical calculations are, but that gamble that he took worked to the advantage of the world. But the heavy lifting at the end of the day is on the shoulders of both Kim and Moon. And frankly, if it were me giving a Time magazine-style Man of the Year, it would be two men, Kim and Moon, because both of them were the right men at the right place at the right time. And the minute Trump took that American nuclear drawbridge and put it into a neutral position, they plowed in. And just as there was no going back in Germany and Europe as a whole in 1989, or in the wider Soviet space in 1991, or indeed in Germany in 1945 for different reasons, this is not going to, it's not going to change. The gates of peace cannot be slammed shut. There will be difficulties and challenges, but this is one of the few, very few things about which I'm virtually entirely optimistic. I don't get to say that a lot. I'm happy to be able to do so.
You and me both. Who'd like to join in? Madam, you know a great deal about Syria, had lived there. It's got to be said that at the end of 2018, things are looking a lot better for Syria than they did, say, 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, Tammy Al-Kabani lived in Syria from 2011 to 2013, so definitely things are looking better. Just want to go back to what you were saying at the beginning about the Palestinian...
falling off the table, yes.
And I just want to... I don't think a lot of people actually realise that the Palestinians have free passage to and from Syria, have the right to own businesses, have the right to an education, and basically the right as any other citizen. Syria has always given them that right. Yarmouk camp, people are under the impression that the Syrian government was bombarding it. It was actually it was ISIS that took over there, and I've been and visited Yarmouk camp quite frequently. I think if the world keeps out of Syria and stops all the sanctions, and just going back to the Russian Cold War, if it's a cold winter this winter, then the UK will definitely be buying Russian gas. So the sanctions don't count when we need it.
It's one of many paradoxes, that, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot of ironies, a lot of
Russia,
hypocrisy.
but they all buy Russian gas.
Well, 2 tankers worth came last year. I mean, it saved the UK from freezing probably to death. So I'm sure once Theresa May had warmed her hands over the fire, she was then able to go back and also going back to the Salisbury, the Porton Down, and the Russians did it, poisoning 2 Russians. I mean, in Porton Down, right up until 1983, the MOD was poisoning British soldiers in gas chambers contained with sarin gas.
This is for experimental purposes.
And they didn't know they were being experimented on. They were told they were testing a cure for the common cold, and I know that having spoken to one of the soldiers who survived, and they still haven't had compensation to this day.
For the international viewer, Porton Down is a military establishment, military scientific. It's had lots of names. It's no longer even called Porton Down. But it's effectively the British Institute for the Research on Chemical and Biological Weapons, and just for the international viewer.
The research and usually guinea pig testing research on on former soldiers that's never recognised and never remembered on Remembrance Day. And the politicians will come out in force on Remembrance Day, and then just months later we'll then go out and think of another war we can do. And then on to Yemen, where people are starving and cholera is rife. Let's remember Haiti, where there was a natural disaster and then the UN peacekeepers went in and spread cholera, and it's been proven that they were the cause of that cholera spread. And now we see the same in Yemen, and people are like, oh, how is this happening, this starvation? This is all deliberate. It's part of the war campaign, which the UK has a big part of by supporting Saudi Arabia. Usually where there's a crisis going on somewhere in the world, the UK is part of it, apart from probably France. Because
what about the fact that General Mad Dog Mattis, the Defense Secretary of the United States, demanded a ceasefire and talks, and indeed he even identified where those talks should be, and he even put a timescale on it, 4 weeks. But that hasn't been kept. Why not?
Are we talking about Syria now?
No, in Yemen.
Yemen, sorry.
Mattis said,
right,
it's got to stop. It's got to stop in 4 weeks. And I need them around a table for peace talks. And that was at least 8 weeks ago, maybe 10.
I find it hard to believe how a country that is orchestrating the war can then say, now we want peace talks.
Well, all the more.
We've had that over and over again. When John McCain crossed the border, the late John McCain now, crossed the border into Syria, posed with the gang members of ISIS, and then they tried to tell us that the US is in there to help Syrian civilians, and then we have Mattis going in now saying, oh, we want a ceasefire. I mean, they're orchestrating the war in Yemen. The starvation, where we're seeing horrific photos of children, and it's horrific. And
Belsen horrors, we used to call those.
I think
pictures.
we also have.
No, I need to take a break now, and I'll come back to you right after this. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London, but reviewing the year and therefore reviewing the world. Mike Yardley, as a military man, I probably should have asked you this in your initial contribution. What is the objective of the Yemen war? The Saudis have bought all this gigantic amounts of high-tech weaponry and so on, but they don't seem to be so good on the ground, so they're not actually able to occupy Yemen. So what is the point of it all?
Well, not really my conflict, but obviously their objective, their strategic objective, is to avoid Iranian-backed forces taking over in the Yemen to their cost. If you look at their recent policy, it's all about, spreading their Sunni message through the Middle East and indeed abroad. I think one of the reasons we see so many Salafist mosques opening up is for that reason. This is looking forward to when the petrol runs out or nobody wants to buy it, and still being able to spread your political influence. There it is, dominating the ground. Coming back to a couple of things which were said, which is very interesting. I mean, the peace fest that's broken out in Korea, great, but it wasn't so long ago that a North Korean ballistic missile was flying over Japan. I mean, that we could go back to that situation so easily. Everything in this, as we see the rise...
You think it's unstable,
utterly
the peace process?
Yeah, very unstable peace process, yes. And we look at the rise of the hard men, whether it's in Putin, whether it's in some places in Europe, whether it's in the US, whether it's even Macron. This is has a 1930s feel to it, and it's disturbing. I passed through Hong Kong fairly recently, and when you see the Chinese leader at one of his party conferences, quite a scary deal, very orchestrated, massive sort of Stalin-esque almost event. And it makes you feel a little bit concerned as to where China is going with that. And you see similar almost all over the world now, where you see the rise of the individual dictator. And that doesn't necessarily mean stability. We were talking about Syria. Well, my main experience of Syria was in the 1980s, and I was in Hama when Assad's father decided to take action against the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm very interested in what's going on there. One of the interesting historical things I found out recently, because I've been researching this, was that if you look at what happened at the end of World War II, and this is fascinating stuff, the Americans, American intelligence, the CIA as it became in the late 40s, did all sorts of weird deals with the Nazis, Nazi intelligence, that they knew, those guys knew they were failing and they didn't want to end up at what would become Nuremberg or something like it. And all sorts of dirty deals were done. One of the dirty deals was that the Americans, the CIA as it would become, took over the Nazi Soviet intelligence network. Very interesting. But what I didn't know was they also took over the contacts and the network that the Nazis had created in the Muslim Brotherhood. And what had happened, apparently, was the Muslim Brotherhood had been weaponized by the Nazis as a potential weapon against the British, obviously, in Egypt. And this was a big deal. And it became quite a thing up to Nasser's rule. And he chucked out many, many members of the Muslim Brotherhood out of Egypt. They went to Saudi. They were too hot to handle in Saudi. The Saudis ended up chucking them out. And that became Al-Qaeda, more or less. But this is a very, very interesting history, and it's not well known at all.
Excellent. Who'd like to join the debate? Yes, sir. Gentleman in the middle.
I would like just to say something. The gentleman asked me about the Yemen. In my opinion, the Saudi government has always destroyed everything in Arabia, whether it is resistance, Nasser, Khomeini. We have a president in Yemen, he's called Ibrahim al-Hamdi. They actually conspired and killed him. And this is true. What the Saudi government is doing is just protecting themselves. They're only protecting the family. Whatever they say, Sunnis, we're spreading this, we're doing that, is absolute garbage.
Are they doing that successfully? I mean, it seems to me if that is their game, they're not doing it very well, because to me, Saudi Arabia looks more unstable today than it has ever done in my lifetime.
I think it's because the social media now has made it very obvious. Before they used to do everything and nobody can say a thing. The Western media was covering everything, but now because of social media, everybody knows what's happening now. And I think the West is actually going blind. They're walking blindly with their old policy. They think they can win this. It's not going to happen, because the whole Arab world now is just so fed up with this. I mean, at the root level, not the people, the politicians, and stuff like this. The people are actually now so angry at the West, which is understandable. What's happened now.
Interesting. Sir, would you like to come in?
Make it very briefly. The other point is, of course, the modern Saudi state was created through an unholy alliance of the Saud family and the Wahhabi priesthood, but backed by US oil company gold. So, this is how the whole thing started, and that's why it goes on. This is the purpose of it. And people, I think you're right, when you travel now, you see that people have lost faith in the West. But even at home, people don't know who are the good guys anymore. And so it's this sort of insecurity, this sort of anxiety, this sort of confusion, which has, I think, been characteristic of the last year.
Would like to make a contribution? Adam?
I think that the Arab world is at a very dangerous crossroads now, because there's not an ideas vacuum. If anything, there's too many ideas, and people tend to get overly excited when the buffet of ideas is presented to them, but without any economic bearing to secure the table. What's needed is leadership, and I think what's frankly needed is a new Nasser. The problem is, where is such a person going to come from? But what we've got to remember in the context of the Arab world is, if it were a superpower, a United Arab Federation, if that were to be the case, it would be a superpower with a population dwarfed only by China and India, with more oil than Russia, more oil, frankly, than anyone in the world, and they would be a formidable force. And yet one of the things that breaks my heart when I talk to Arabs is the minute this idea is proposed to them, whether by an Arab or whether by a non-Arab such as myself, people talk about differences in dialect dialect and regional history and even differences in the food one eats and how one eats it. This hasn't stopped China from being a united nation. My God, it's not even stopped the two Koreas, similar people but with very different recent political histories, from shaking hands. It hasn't stopped the European Union, imperfect though that is, and it hasn't stopped the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, from forming a free trade area and expanding cooperation ever more. If the Arabs don't realize that without unity, a bad situation could be replaced by something even worse, then I'm afraid that on the other end of this Dickensian spectrum, the Arab world could be in store for what, even compared to today, might be considered the worst of times.
Well, I tell you, that's a good cue to go to the Vox Pops. We took the Kalimahora camera onto the streets of London and asked some of these questions. Let's take a look.
With the eradication of ISIS in Syria, do you think that things will improve there now?
Hopefully, if they stop fighting between each other internally, it should go better. Less enemies you have, it should improve. Hopefully, I think the rest of the world needs to do much more to help what's happening in there, to be honest. Europe, united, and United States, everybody.
Absolutely. I mean, it can only be a good thing if ISIS are disintegrated and eradicated from the earth. My word.
And do you think there is an end to the war in Yemen possibly on the horizon now?
I don't know. I'm not as versed as what I perhaps could be regarding that. You can only hope.
Hopefully, yes. I think we have to be together, and I don't think not helping those countries getting off the war is the answer, because that's not good. And I hope the war is over very soon for the good of everybody, living there, living here, everybody.
Well, hopefully, yeah, because it's crazy. A lot of innocent people losing their lives. Kids, like, not even reaching a certain age and already dead. It's crazy, man. It's insane. So hopefully it ends pretty soon.
Do you think after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi that things might change in Saudi Arabia?
Again, I don't know, I'm afraid. It's certainly going to raise some questions, and people are certainly going to sit up and pay attention now that this issue's come about, but I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know was the most frequently entered answer to the questions on the street there, and that's not perhaps surprising, because I'm not sure that anybody knows where the world is headed. We didn't even talk about Africa in my opening remarks. It's been a momentous year also. Robert Mugabe, who looked like he was going to stay there for several centuries, has now gone, and a new president there. There are ongoing conflicts across Africa, of course, but Africa is becoming an economic success story, not the least because of very substantial Chinese investment in Africa, which is beginning to transform the landscape, but of course posing questions about what China really wants out of Africa and how much will Africans be driving the economic development of their continent. These are all big questions. Just put up your hand if you'd like to join in. Anyone who's not yet spoken would be good. Madam, back to you.
Yeah, I just want to go back to what was being said about Syria and fighting amongst themselves. I think we've seen in some of the previous conversations being had that people are aware, but there are sanctions being made on Syria over the past 7-8 years. Taxpayers' money and millions of pounds of it has been handed over to people that are unvetted, have no criminal background check, completely unchecked, not only the UK has handed over millions of pounds of money. William Hague was at the border with Angelina Jolie, handing over £5 million just in one go. He was too afraid to step foot into Syria, but he was happy to hand over the taxpayers' money. Until that stops as well, on top of that, we've had them bombing, ad hoc bombing. Syria is bombed quite frequently as well by Israel. I survived an Israeli bombing campaign when I was in Damascus. Goodness knows why they're continuing to do frequent. That's never covered in the news either. And people call it a civil war.
Let me just expand your point, because it is an interesting point. Operation Shader, the UK's involvement in Syria, the aerial campaign, is a major deal, and the British public are not really aware of it. There have been more RAF missions flown than were flown in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. I think something getting on for 12 or 1,300 major operations. This is a huge deal, and yet we never hear about it. No. This is a hidden war, by and large, which is extraordinary.
I wanted to ask you a question on the same subject. What's going to happen to all these Western and Eastern foreign so-called jihadists? I don't like to use that word, but that's what they call themselves. Yeah. What's going to happen to... They haven't all been killed, have they? And some of them must be back in our midst.
Your instinct's absolutely right. What happens is, if there appears to be victory on the ground for the Syrian and Russian forces against the radicals, those guys aren't just going to go away. They're not all going to be killed. The idea isn't dead. And the people coming back as well. That is going to intensify the terrorist threat that we face. No doubt about it.
It's bound to, because I mean, a lot of these terrorist attacks in Europe, and indeed here in London and in Manchester and elsewhere, are not carried out by and large by people who were there, but people who wished they were there, or their hearts were there, and perhaps even their cousins or their brothers were there. What about when those that are there come back to add to their strength?
And who have had... The problem with terrorism's quite an easy thing to do if you have the will and the motivation. I just wanted to come back to Africa, though, because Africa's a fascinating subject. A long time ago, I travelled through Tanzania and Zambia on the Tazara Railway. That was the Chinese-built railway when China first started, getting involved in Africa. Then I travelled a lot around Africa. And what you go to somewhere in the middle of nowhere and you'd find a Chinese general store. There was a Chinese general store at the end of every dirt track. And you thought, cracking on, what are these all for? They can't make money out of the business that they're getting. And then you see, as you travel more recently, in the last 15 years, 20 years, you see everywhere there is a Chinese mining operation, logging operation, whatever it may be. Vast investment by China, particularly in anything that would be, they're looking for resources, of course, that can be useful to them. And they have played a brilliant game. And the Chinese have a great advantage in Africa. They're not white. And so, that has made it much easier for them to negotiate. And when you see what happens in Africa now, which has been transformed, particularly by the mobile telephone, you used to not be able to communicate in Africa. Now they work better there than they do here. So Africa is changing very, very quickly, and it's a fascinating.
And John Bolton was just a day or two ago announcing that the United States now intends to contest what he calls Chinese and Russian influence in Africa. The problem is China brings investment and jobs, and everyone gets richer. United States involvement in Africa, indeed much like our own, is likely to be a bit more of the negative kind, don't you think?
Yeah, I do, and I think the Chinese game has been a very, very clever one.
Clever people, the Chinese. We'll be right back. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, for Al-Mayadeen Television. The year closed rather unexpectedly, I must say, with an uprising in France. you wonder if eventually they'll storm the Bastille like they did once before, and whether President Macron, once the great hope of neoliberals and liberals everywhere, might face the same fate as the Bourbons did some centuries before. Let's hope not, at least on that last point. It's also been a year of sanctions. I've never heard the word sanctions mentioned so much as I have this year. I've seen sanctions up close and personal in Iraq before the war in 2003. I know what they smell like. Sanctions are not a clean alternative to war, and yet they are showered around like confetti. It would be easier to name the countries that the United States is not currently sanctioning than it would be those that it is. Let's hear what the people thought about these subjects.
Do you think the civil unrest in France is justified or understandable?
I think it's kind of understandable. People is just asking for rights and for what they deserve, and people deserve to be treated as everybody would like to be treated.
I don't agree so much with violence in general, even if maybe the reason why someone is fighting could be right. But violence is not the answer, and therefore I can understand why they're doing this, but I don't approve it at all.
Civil unrest, yes, but violence, no. I don't know if we always should be resorting to that as the first option. Yeah.
Everyone fighting for their rights, so strike is basically trying to get their point and opinions across, so I don't pretty much know, as I'm here in the UK.
I think France have always had a long history of like civil unrest, and they are very vocal when they protest. And I think this is probably part of the bigger picture again, when a lot of the gap between the rich and the poor is getting wider and wider, and it's sort of it articulates itself in many ways. Brexit is one, I think Donald Trump is the other one, and very obviously civil unrest in France is probably one of them. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where it goes.
Do you think a rise in energy costs, largely due to US sanctions, will cause further unrest in other countries?
I think so, and I think these protests in France will set an example, and I think people will move and will go out of their homes and just start saying, hey, we don't want that. This is just not right for the people. We don't deserve to be treated like that, and just we need to have power and we need to be able to pay for that. So,
people are always motivated by their hip pocket, so if people are increase on living costs, the rise, it always gets people's attention, and no doubt would have some unrest. Yeah.
It's rather odd because most of the violence I've been looking at on my TV in France is the violence of the forces of the state. The French police are dishing out most of the violence. Unrest works, Adam Garrie, as the French have proved. Macron has just showered euros down the Champs-Élysées. He's just broken all the fiscal rules of the European Union. He's taken France into a 3.5% budget deficit in order to pay for a huge giveaway to the people to try and dampen down the unrest. Maybe if other countries had been as unrestful as France has been over the last 5 weeks, in just 5 weeks, they have moved the Macron government. By the time this goes out, he might even be moved out of the Elysée. What's your reading on that?
Well, my reading on that actually has to do more with governance than with the specific grievances, which, as you rightly state, could be juxtaposed onto other countries. When we're talking about democracies, I really think that the outmoded presidential system is something that actually prohibits a more direct connection to the people and a more transparency to the people versus a parliamentary system. Now, while France does have a parliament, it's not a strong parliament because they've got a
Nobody
powerful
knows anyone that's in it.
Indeed. The Gaullist system introduced when it became the French Fifth Republic, as we know it, and maybe don't love it today, just ask the Frenchmen themselves, in 1958, it established this presidential system, and there is, in Article 49 of the Constitution, a system whereby a vote of no confidence in the Parliament can be passed, but it doesn't do anything with the President, and in fact, the only time it was ever tried in 1962 when the Prime Minister was the Gaullist Pompidou. His Gaullist faction was re-elected after Parliament was dissolved. So I think this is an issue that we're going to hear a lot about, the difference between what one can achieve in a parliamentary system versus a presidential system. There was a referendum on this very issue last year in Turkey, one of the countries which, like China and Russia, has found success with the opposite of a parliamentary system. But in most cases, a parliamentary system is in fact more effective. It's why Macron is going to serve out the rest of his term, because you can't remove a French president unless he commits high crimes that would make Bill Clinton's impeachable offense about lying about his under-desk affairs laughable. Theresa May, by contrast, will probably be gone maybe by the time this show...
By the time we leave here this afternoon.
It may well
perhaps.
be.
Yeah. Let's take... no, I want to get some backbench opinion in. The gentleman there, distinguished-looking gentleman.
Just wanted to follow up on the talk of Syria. Syria it suffered this year, and hopefully we'll see the back of the fanatics that the Saudis and the West have imposed upon them. This is rather like if Putin, the all-powerful, all-seeing Putin, had wished to destabilise France, or in this case, say America, he would have armed the
He
West.
is being blamed for France, by the way.
Oh, is he? Oh, right.
The French had no idea how to make a revolution until Putin told them.
Behind every good revolution there's a Russian, I suppose. But it'd be like arming the Westboro Baptist Church in America. That's what's happened to Syria. The Americans, McCain, Hillary Clinton, the whole of the Obama administration gifted Syria the Westboro Baptist Church, gave them guns, gave them material, gave them diplomatic cover, and they had all the people that were behind that in France, from Sarkozy, from Cameron, from Haig, have walked away. But their haunting of Syria today is that they still want Assad out. They still want the people to suffer. They want to ignore the wishes of the people of Syria. They wish to dictate from their positions working for merchant banks. What I would say is that in France now you've got this being replicated in Britain, where the far right is taking over. The Gilets jaunes on the London Bridge we saw the other day was a load of far right lunatics that we're trying to take that spirit away from a right cause in France to make it far right in Britain.
Yeah, but as Mike Yardley put it at the beginning of the programme, the political system is in real crisis. One could argue that it's in collapse. I personally would argue that it's in collapse. The centre cannot hold. And what would have been described as extremes, I spent almost 30 years sitting on the back benches of the British Parliament with somebody called Jeremy Corbyn, who was considerably more left-wing than me, and I'm quite left-wing. And now he might be the Prime Minister of Britain soon. So these things are happening more and more and everywhere. There's also the issue, isn't there, that the traditional things that divided left and right have begun to blur. So that, for example, there are many people on the right that oppose foreign wars, oppose the Iraq war, oppose the Syrian intervention and so on. And there are many people on the left that supported those wars. So left and right are beginning to morph and blur in the traditional way.
Yeah, well, we've got the shift from traditional anti-imperial wars as viewed from the prism of the left, with the narrow narrow nationalist self-interest of the far right. We've also seen in Britain the rise of Tommy Robinson and being welcomed into the arms of UKIP as it's slowly disappeared.
None of that will be understood in Lebanon, I fear. Let's go to the gentleman there.
Thank you very much, George. I wonder if Bashar al-Assad will be arming the Gilets jaunes. That would be fair,
well,
wouldn't it?
Well, if you think about it, I mean, we laugh, but the logic is exactly the same. The French state is oppressing its people. I've just been looking at a video of a CRS policeman in France armed with a claw hammer. He's been videoed walking around with full kit and a claw hammer, looking for a demonstrator to pulverize with it. So the French people are rising up and the French state is clamping down. When are we starting bombing France? Because that's exactly the logic that drove the Western intervention in Syria, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We said earlier on that, or someone said that we need another Nasser. And Arab nationalism began when the Muslims of the Middle East were united under the Khilafah. And Lawrence of Arabia told them, well, you're Arabs and you need to be separate from Ottoman rule. And then when Arab nationalism was prevalent throughout the Middle East, it became the opposite. And Saddam Hussein was toppled. Gaddafi, another pan-Africanist and Arab nationalist, toppled. He's toppled by Islamists. Islamists nearly toppled Bashar al-Assad, but it seems the Arabs can't unite either as Arabs or as Muslims, because the outside forces will always use the other identity.
What are they, children?
Well,
I mean, I've had this argument on this channel many, many times before. What are you going to do? Sit and suck your argile and blame the Ottomans, blame the British, blame the French? You're not children. You're 350 million adults, stretching from the Atlantic to the Gulf. If you want to unite, you can unite.
Under any banner.
Don't blame it on Johnny Foreigner.
Very true.
Because that just makes you seem like a child.
I mean, this gentleman is quite right. I mean, Lawrence's huge achievement was bringing everyone together to that end, but he found it very, very difficult. You know, the inherent
he discovered that the
tensions
British government he was working for was lying.
Yeah, and then he turns up at the peace process half dressed as an Arab and half dressed as a Brit, and then loses himself at the Air Force.
I think the gentleman put his finger on it right. The British were in favour of Arab nationalism to break up the Muslims, and they're in favour of Islamism to break up the Arab nationalists. They're not actually in favour of either. They just want to break it up.
Isn't the question, though, that we've all been talking about, whatever, differences of political opinion may be, the question of 2018 is how democratic is democracy? Because it seems that our system is certainly being challenged. It's not necessarily breaking down. It looks shaky at the moment. But I think a lot of people are beginning to realise in all sorts of different places that the system, call it what you will, them, the system, government, isn't serving them as it should. And something is fundamentally wrong, that they are not adequately represented. They may send delegates to something that we call a parliament or something else, but they feel frustrated. They feel that their views are not getting through to the people that count. They think the people that are there in government, sitting on the benches, they don't trust them. They think they may have their snouts in the trough for personal gain. This is a feeling that you see across the world.
Well, we have political, this lady here, please. We have political democracy, but we don't have economic democracy. And it's economic democracy that people need because they're poor, whilst others are rich. And the richer you are, the richer you're becoming. And the poorer you are, the poorer you're becoming. And your political system doesn't allow you to tackle it. Madam.
Yeah, I'm Cheryl. I'm an amateur, an old amateur. I would look at 2018 as even a war against lawfare. And that term could be put when you're talking about Julian Assange. Here we have a hero like Julian Assange languishing in the Bolivian Republic, having been given a Bolivian Ecuador passport by our
Bolivia are good.
Our Ecuador, another hero, Rafa Correa, who kindly gave him a passport, hoping that this hero who have given us so much information about the wickedness of the USA, Mossad, CIA, and all that lot. Here he is in the middle of London, languishing there without sunlight, with a bad hip, and made him throw away his cat, really punishing him. There is Viral Wyszynski languishing away in Ukraine. Where's it going to stop? Hockey boss thrown in jail by Moreno, who's doing the bidding of USA. We've got...
You didn't say his first name. Moreno.
Lenin Moreno, sorry.
That's the biggest shocker of them all. A man called Lenin Moreno is doing the United States' bidding. We've got to take a break. We'll be right back. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, for Al-Mayadeen Television. We are discussing the year 2018, though it would take us a week to discuss even the highlights and the lowlights of that year. Madam.
Okay. أولا أنا ما كنت جاهزة اليوم لأحكي بس حأحكي باختصار. بدي أقول أرجع بالنسبة للحرب بسوريا أو باليمن أو حتى الآن ما يجري بفرنسا. إذا بدنا نجي نشوف مين هو الخاسر بالحرب، أكيد الخاسر الأكبر هو إسرائيل، إن كان بالحرب بسوريا ولا باليمن، لأنه مش نحن بس بنقول هيك، حتى المحللين الإسرائيليين إذا بنتابع تحليلاتهم على القناة الثانية بنشوف إنه هن دائما بتصريحاتهم عم بيأكدوا إنه إسرائيل هي الخاسر الأكبر وإنه إيران حتكون هي الرابح الأكبر. أنا ليش بقول هيك؟ إنه بالشعب اليمني أو بالشعب السوري عنده الروح المقاومة، عندهم حب الجهاد، يعني حب الدفاع عن الوطن. هن مش إرهابيين كما بيوصفوهم، لأنه هن مصرين على حماية أرضهم وبلدهم، فأكيد هن بالنهاية حيكونوا رابحين، مش المعتدي هو حيكون الرابح. طب ليش اليمن؟ مثل ما هلأ نحن عم نسأل هذا السؤال، هل اليمن إنه حتوقف الحرب باليمن بعد مقتل الخاشقجي؟ طب إذا الحرب بدها توقف، يعني لازم كنا ننتظر إنه يقتل الخاشقجي حتى تتوقف الحرب وبهي الطريقة وبهي الأسلوب؟ إنه خلينا نسأل بس هيدا السؤال، إذا كان في إجابة لهيدا السؤال ساعتها بنعرف. بس أنا بقول لا، الحرب هلأ مش حتتوقف كرمال إنه مقتل الخاشقجي، لأنه في حب الثورة، حب الصمود. كمان هلأ صاروا هن متحمسين أكتر إنه هن عم بيحققوا انتصارات أكتر، فحتستمر الحرب يمكن لفترة قليلة.
Madam, can I ask you, do you think there will be a war in 2019 again between Israel and Lebanon? Will there be another 2006 type confrontation?
الحرب حتكون، بس أنا ما بقدر أجزم إنه حتكون ب 2019، بس حرب أكيد في حرب. يعني كل التأشيرات بتأكد إنه في حرب، وإسرائيل دائما بتهدد إنه في حرب، وبكل الأحوال نحن بلبنان مستعدين لأي حرب نخوضها مع إسرائيل، وإن شاء الله إنه نحن المنتصرين بهاي الحرب القادمة أو بغيرها. بس بعتقد حتكون الأخيرة، يعني لو صارت حرب فحتكون الأخيرة. أكيد حيكون في حرب بس مش أكيد بال 2019.
It's just that there are many reports just in the last few days that there will be an outbreak of hostilities, that Israel will attack Hezbollah, and one of the Israeli ministers just said that they will take Lebanon back to the Stone Age. And when asked by a US journalist, do you mean Hezbollah or Lebanon? He said the same thing, both of them. So tension is definitely mounting on that border. Who else would like to contribute? We're reviewing 2018, but of course we're also looking forward to 2019. Adam, you had something to say, I think, about China. I think you wanted to challenge something that was said about China earlier.
Well, I wanted to build upon it. You said earlier about how the mobile phone networks are revolutionizing Africa. It's also becoming an important payment system. But beyond this, any discussion about Africa's development needs to lead to the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, I could go into the 60 billion in US dollars that China gave Africa in just one go. They gave even more across Africa over 2018. But as 2019 approaches, I think we have reached a line in the sand with Belt and Road. I've always believed, as have millions of others, though we rarely get our views known outside of China and people that discuss China, but I believe that Belt and Road presents the greatest opportunity to uplift the human condition on a material basis.
Just explain what is the Belt and Road Initiative, because as you just say, not that many people know about it, and yet it is truly a gigantic undertaking.
It is truly. It's a global mega project. It was announced in 2013 by Xi Jinping, the president of China, and the idea is to build new physical corridors of connectivity for trade and human interaction across the continents. One of the most visible outgrowths of this thus far is CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which goes in from the China-Pakistan border all the way down to the port city of Gwadar in the south, in the Baluchistan province of Pakistan. But this is just one very visible of many trading belts and trading roads and maritime belts that China wants to build. But there's more than just the physical and logistical component. There's also the component of opening up politically to new markets so that countries that had been physically isolated from world trade previously can have their goods go on to Chinese shelves, which means lots of money coming into the coffers of developing nations. It also gives China the opportunity to invest in symbiotic structural, infrastructural projects in partner nations, which makes it very different from the briefcase full of cash with lots of strings attached that American partners of various developing nations build. And also for developed nations, Belt and Road offers an opportunity for such nations like those in the EU to avoid the plague of stagnation, which is really what's causing some of the unrest we were discussing earlier, and to help create new avenues for both imports and exports. So it's a highly ambitious project, but all of the naysayers who have tried to traduce China's achievements since 1978 in particular, when Deng Xiaoping opened up China to market socialism by saying, I don't care if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. When he made that statement, 88% of Chinese were in legally defined poverty, so far as the UN defines it. Now that number is below 2%. By the end of 2020, it's projected to go to 0%. Underestimating China is, in my view, a fool's game, although maybe not too foolish, because one can make a lot of money in certain countries or even get appointed Secretary of State in some countries for doing it. But I believe that as this year closed and the CFO of Huawei, the biggest smartphone company in the world, a Chinese company, took over from Apple, the American company, earlier this year, her arrest in Canada, her kidnapping on purely politicized charges, now gives Belt and Road not just a moral component in a material sense, but in a metaphysical sense, because America has shown that it's willing to use its might, the might of its intelligence services, of a politicized Justice Department, and indeed its military to thwart the progress of nations that are voluntarily engaged in the bilateral partnerships throughout Belt and Road. Nations that are looking at what the United States, via its Canadian proxy, did to this innocent woman, this mother, this daughter. They'll look at all the propaganda, the black propaganda being spewed about China, and they will say China does not do this to its partners. The US does this to an adversary that it should be partnering with now in trade discussions, and has done so via a proxy. It set a precedent that risks taking us back to a pre-First World War mentality, when rival blocs of protectionist nations went to war with each other to destroy the other bloc's market share. It risks pushing the world to that, where the Chinese open model is pushing the world towards the opposite.
Why did China, or what will, I better put it that way, what will, I want to just press this Huawei point, what is China going to do about this act of international piracy, for that is what it is? It's like the SFO of Apple being seized at Russian demands at Finland airport. It's a remarkably brazen act of brigandry. What is China going to do about it?
Well, it's pure banditry, but China, in terms of its gradualist mentality, knows full well that Sun Tzu said the following: appear strong when you are weak, and appear weak when you are strong. No one could possibly seek to appear stronger than a man who names every building he steps in after himself and gilds everything from the chain on the loo to the chain on his wives, metaphorically speaking, of course. Well, not the gilding, but the chaining. But China is it's taken a very moderate approach to this. They have voiced their firm disgust about this. They have warned of grave consequences if this goes on. And indeed, it's probably related, though the full story isn't fully known. Two Canadian businessmen, and one of them was a former diplomat, was arrested in China. So China can very much leverage Canada in this, and Trudeau and Ottawa wouldn't really have much of a leg to stand on. But thus far, China hasn't reacted in the hysterical way that, for example, certain Western governments make when mysterious things happen. In other words, this language of highly likely and j'accuse towards anyone whose name happens to be Vladimir, or even looks like he might be called Vladimir. We're not hearing this because China is operating from a position of strength, but it knows how to hide it. And I believe that a proper result will come of this, but the precedent the US has set will automatically draw people to China in terms of sympathy, and more important, draw them to Belt and Road in terms of their business and geopolitical partnerships.
Mike, that kind of points in the direction of the last point I wanted to end on, really. Whilst most of the huffing and puffing is about Russia, China is the big enchilada, isn't it? It is the biggest threat to United States hegemony in the world.
China is huge, and I don't agree with all of Adam's analysis, but in one thing he's absolutely right. Brand China looks a lot stronger and brighter than brand America. And that is worrying, and that, like the Russians, China is rearming. China is a huge power. It's also trying to sell us a lot of stuff, so it never forgets that. And probably the answer to the question that Adam was putting is that's the reason. I mean, the reason business continues as per normal, more or less, is because the Chinese are dependent on the US markets, the European markets, and many others. There is another very important point I wanted to make here, though, because we look at everything that's happened in the last 12 months. Many people are a bit anxious and a bit confused about it. But I think there is a fundamental shift going on. I think people are becoming much more aware of the fact that there are people out there trying to manipulate them. I think this is a change. I think for years people have switched on the BBC or ABC or whatever it may be, CNN, and they've more or less taken everything at face value. People have stopped taking things at face value. They realise that they're very powerful people, be they globalists, be they corporations, be they governments, whatever, who are trying to influence them. They are changing. They're changing in the way they look at power. And I think that is going to lead to massive political change in the next few years. What might happen, we might see some sort of economic collapse happening in the next few years because we're approaching the end of the financial cycle. And that probably will be when we would see some sort of fundamental political reorganisation. We can only speculate. We can only guess what form it might take. But one thing I'm quite sure, we ain't seen nothing yet. Big changes coming.
That's a very good point to end on. We ain't seen nothing yet. It's true at the end of every year. It's perhaps more true at the end of this than of most years, because most of the actors and most of the events that have made 2018 so interesting are still, at the time of recording, in their seats atop their horses with their lances still in their hands. Whether they will be this time next year, let's hope we're all back together again and still here in order to discuss it. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you here on Kalimahorra.